Good evening and welcome to the Cima revisions for performance management. I'm Praveen Rajaratnam, and the next two episodes we should be running through one of the subjects which has caused quite a few issues for students at exams, which is performance management, or P2. Before we actually get down to the content of the subject, a couple of things that I just want to mention regarding the subject itself. Under the 2010 syllabus that Cima launched, this is one of those papers that has really shocked quite a few students, because this particular subject has a wide mix of both theory as well as calculations, and a lot of students get into the subject expecting it to be a numerical one, whereas the fact of the matter is you need to be very realistic and look forward to about 50% of numbers, maybe 50% theory, and in fact there's nothing for us to hide. The last exam diet was a bit of a shocker, where most students walked out of the exam saying, I think there was about 70% theory and about 30% numbers. So let's just hope this exam diet, it's going to be a little more calculation based, it'll be a little more normal, which should be along the lines of what Cima has been hinting. But students, you need to be prepared for a fair bit of calculations and theory as well. So it's a good mix, right? And getting down to the subject itself, well, all papers at the management level tend to have a similar sort of a structure, where you've got section A, where you've got 5 10-mark questions with mini scenarios, and section B, 2 25-mark questions, and the paper is 100% compulsory, right? So it's the same across all three papers at this particular level. But looking at the syllabus content, if you take a look at the slide, you'll see the syllabus is split into 4 nice topics, and Cima tries to, of course, test it based on this particular weightage: pricing, product decisions, where you'll see things like CVP analysis and break even and limiting factor, all of that coming in. The second part of the syllabus, which is cost planning analysis for competitive advantage, little techniques which maybe students try to ignore. JIT, TQM, kaizen, functional analysis, value analysis, few of those theory topics. So since those are topics that students don't tend to like too much, those are little bits that I will try to focus on over the next couple of episodes then. Budgeting and management control. Of late, the examiner has tested a few numbers with regard to budgeting, but you need to understand that primarily what you're likely to see at the exam would be theoretical questions. Okay, could involve things like participatory budgeting, could involve things like zero-based budgeting, or even feed-forward control for that matter, but it is likely to be primarily theory. If you do see a few calculations on maybe a flexed budget, comparison with an actual arriving at a variance, well, that's a bonus, right? The last part of your syllabus, which is something that Cima tended to underplay with the last exam diet: responsibility centers, performance measurement, and effectively transfer pricing. Okay, which went completely missing in the last paper. So balance of probabilities, we're probably looking for a nice big question this time. Okay, so this is effectively our overall syllabus, and over the next couple of episodes, what I hope to do is just run you through a few of the basic concepts, so that you have a clear understanding, and maybe some of those areas which students do find a little difficult. Okay, it wouldn't be very practical for us to be running through past paper questions here, but hopefully that we should be able to run through a few of these problematic topics and clear out some of the problems that you have. And the first topic I'd really like to run through is learning curve. It's one of those topics which the examiner tends to test almost every single session, almost, right? And tends to be a bit of a bonus when students do see it. So what's learning curves? the definition in itself would simply say that the cumulative average time taken to produce output should reduce, right, as output doubles. Now, what is it in simple terms? In very simple terms, as employees keep repeating a task, they get better at it, right? So if they get better at it, they should be taking lesser and lesser time as they produce more and more output. And that is the basics of what learning curve actually focuses on. If you look at the slide, you'll see the standard definition right on top, and then the simpler version as a second point there. So cumulative average time per unit produced is assumed to fall by a constant percentage every time total output of the product doubles. So you're talking about maybe employees getting better at it and therefore taking 90% of the time taken to produce the first unit. And that just keeps continuing, right? So it's a constant percentage decrease in the time taken. And if you look at this in terms of numbers, just still on the slide, you'll see that 80% learning curve, and I've given you output and gone with the theory, given you a perfect doubling of output. Output's gone from 1 to 2, 2 to 4 units, 4 to 8, and you'll see output's continuously doubling. And average time taken for the first unit is 100 hours, and effectively the cumulative average taken for 2 units is 80 hours. So I've taken 80% of the 100 hours. And you move on to the next level of output, which is 4 units. It's been 80% of the cumulative average for 2 units. That should be 80 hours. So 80 multiplied by 80%, you end up with 64. So this trend just keeps continuing. And if by chance you really want to arrive at total time taken for production, it's a matter of multiplying the cumulative average, hours per unit, by the output. So you'll notice the third column there with information on hours and so on should be 100 multiplied by 1 unit. You have 100 hours taken in total. And the second value you see there is 160, which is 80 hours taken on average multiplied by 2 units. And as we go along, it's 64 hours taken on average multiplied by 4 units, then 51.2 hours taken on average multiplied by 8 units, and we keep going on. And you'll notice that the cumulative average time taken to produce a unit has continuously dropped, and it's dropped by 20% effectively. In other words, time taken is effectively 80% of the time taken for the previous output, right, on average per unit. So this is effectively what you look at as learning curve. And this is a very, very important concept, and it's quite important for a lot of organizations to understand that a learning curve exists, because at the point of launching their new products, chances are their production costs are very, very high. But once employees get used to producing the particular output, they should see time taken to produce the output drop quite drastically. And companies need to factor these things in when they set their selling price, because if they set their selling price too high, chances are that the product will not sell, right? And sometimes companies actually try to launch products that already exist on the market, so they're trying to launch similar products, and it becomes a bit of a price war. Okay, so it's very important that they actually get their costing right, and learning curves form quite an important part of them determining their overall cost per unit. Okay, so this is with an 80% learning. And you look at the same thing, if we again focus on the slide, I've taken it to a 90% learning, the same concept pretty much. Output of 1, 2, 4, 8, 16 and 32. And you'll notice this time, cumulative average time taken for the second unit is 90% of what was taken for the first unit. So it's 90% for 2 units compared to the first unit, and 90% of time taken for the 2 units is what you'll see with 4 units. And this trend goes on. But what I really wanted to pinpoint by looking at this is a bit of a summary. I put the two side by side, and you'll notice that with an 80% learning, the average time taken for 2 units is 80. With a 90% learning, average time taken for 2 units is 90. And the total time taken for 2 units with 80% learning would be 160 hours. Whereas with a 90% learning, it's 180 hours. So this brings us to the question, which is better for an organization? Is it better if they see 80% learning? Is it better if you see 90% learning? Just simply focusing on these particular numbers, you look at the totals, it seems that taking, 160 hours to produce 2 units in total under 80% learning compared to 180 hours for 2 units under 90% learning, companies, chances are, would pick 80% learning, given a choice. Because the time taken to produce the unit seems to be lower with 80% learning. Right, so this is a bit of a summary that we could look at, where we've got 80% and 90% learnings, what I've taken from the previous table. If you just look at the slide, you'll see that you've got both side by side, 80% learning and 90% learning. And average time taken for 2 units under 80% learning is about 80 hours, which basically means total time taken for 2 units works out to about 160 hours. Whereas with a 90% learning, average time taken for 2 units is 90 hours. And the total time taken, effectively 180 hours. Now, and if you make a comparison right throughout, you'll notice that average time taken to produce the output at 80% learning is continuously smaller than the average time taken to produce an output with 90% learning. And so is your total time taken. Total time taken under 80% learning always seems to be, in this case, smaller. Right? So effectively, the average time taken to produce an output with an 80% learning seems to be smaller. Okay? Which means the company should save quite a bit of time and money by going for an 80% learning given a choice. Right? So an 80% learning compared to a 90% learning seems better for the company. But it's not that companies always have this choice. So there's a range of factors that actually influence the rate of learning. So it could simply involve the level of training that has been provided to the employees. It could be the working environment. It could be the repetitive nature of the tasks. You take companies like Mini Cooper that manufacture cars. When they usually bring in a new model, chances are that the new model is worked on side by side with the existing models. And the chance of the employee being able to apply that learning is slightly lower, purely because they're working on all the models side by side, compared to a company which would simply only produce the new product from that point onwards, because they're just doing that particular task, they get much better at it. Right? So in summary, what we're looking at is larger the learning percentage, lower the actual learning. You'll see that on the slide. So you see a 90% learning, it's not as good as maybe a 80% learning from the company's point of view. So they'd be looking at achieving that effectively lower percentage, right? So that learning curves, that's one aspect that the examiner looks at. But we can't expect the examiner to keep testing a perfect doubling of output, right? So what is it that we get to do at the exam? Well, here's a rough schedule for you. I've again taken it out of the 80% learning. You'll notice that the average time taken for 2 units seems to be 80. So 100 multiplied by 80% gives you that 80. And it just keeps going on. Now at the exam, you have the capability to use a formula. And the formula is right there. You've got y equals ax to the power b. You look at the slide, you'll see that. Y is the average time taken to produce a batch or unit. It's the cumulative average time taken, effectively. A is the time taken to produce the first unit. In this case, it's 100 hours. And x number of units or batches produced. And B is the learning coefficient, which is given to you by the examiner, and it's always a minus value. It's, in this case, it's minus 0.3219, and when we put that on, we should end up with an cumulative average time of 51.2 hours. You'll notice if I pick 8 units. So just to make a comparison, just take a look at this. 8 units on the schedule, the cumulative average time seems to be 51.2 hours. Use the formula, 100 hours taken for the first unit, 8 seems to be the number of units that we're going to produce, and you've got a learning coefficient of minus 0.3219. You have a cumulative average time taken of 51.2 hours to produce the 8 units. So simply using the formula does appear to give us this answer. So this is effectively what we end up using at the exam every time the examiner asks us to calculate the average time taken, or they ask for the total time taken to produce an output. Use the formula, get the cumulative average time taken, multiply it by the output, and you've got the total time taken to produce an output. So that's one aspect that the examiner tends to test. We'll go in for a short break, and when we get back, we'll look at the second half of what the examiner can test on learning curve. Welcome back. And the topic we were discussing was learning curves, and we've looked at one avenue over the examiner could test, which is pretty much calculating the cumulative average time taken to produce a particular output, and then from there going to the total time taken to produce an output. The second aspect that the examiner tends to test is calculation of a learning rate. And to be honest, the accurate and the best method to go about this is the use of log, right? That we tend to use log and anti-log to calculate the learning rate, but the good news is the Cima examiner does not expect you to have knowledge of log and anti-log. So the questions that you receive are simplified, and you will see a perfect doubling of output at the exam. So output levels the examiner is likely to test when requiring you to calculate learning rate. Would either be 2 units, 4 units, 8 units, 16, 32, 64, or 128. So it's always a perfect doubling of output, right? You're not going to get anything in between, which effectively helps us to use a bit of a shortcut. If we focus on the slide, you'll see a slightly different formula. It's not the y equals ax to the power b formula that you see normally used. This is a slightly different formula, and it's a bit of a shortcut to calculate your learning percentage. You'll notice cumulative average time taken for the nth batch. So it could be for 32 batches, it could be for 64 batches. But what's important is that you take the cumulative average time. Okay, and time taken for the first batch. We also need to look at the learning rate and the number of cycles. So what we hope to calculate here will be this particular learning rate. Okay, so the formula is effectively cumulative average time taken for the nth batch is equal to time taken for the first batch multiplied by the learning rate to the power number of cycles. So let's see how this works using an example. Very quickly, you'll notice I've given you outputs, again perfect doublings of output on this particular schedule. First unit takes 100 hours. Cumulative average time taken for 32 units is 59.049, right? And I have not told you what the learning rate is. In fact, I've picked this out of one of the previous schedules that we had looked at. Looking through what we need to do. Now I've got my components. Time taken for the first batch is 100. Time taken for the nth batch, in this case for 32 units, is 59.049. That's the average time taken. And the third component that I need to calculate my learning rate would be the number of cycles. So how many doublings of output do we actually have? That's 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So output has doubled effectively 5 times. So moving on to how the formula should look, you'll see 59.049 is the time taken to produce 32 units, 100 hours taken to produce the first unit, and X would here effectively represent our learning rate, and I have 5 doublings of output, 5 cycles, right? If we solve this effectively, we'll need to take the 5th root of 59.049 divided by 100. You should end up with a learning rate of about 90%. So chances are the examiner is going to test the average time or the learning rate for 32 units, 64 units, 128 units, and generally doesn't go beyond that. None of the past paper questions have gone beyond that, and chances are we should see the same trend repeat. So this is effectively what you could basically expect at the exam. So 2 formulae, right? 2 formulae, one which we use for the calculation of the average time and the total time taken. A second one is to calculate the learning rate, right? So this is all done without really detailed knowledge of log and anti-log. So in summary, questions that the examiner does test. Just focusing on the slide, you'll see the variety that the examiner could test, calculating time or cost for a given output, right, which requires the use of that formula, y equals ax to the power b. Second is calculating the learning rate, which is when we use our second formula, which is cumulative average time taken for the nth batch, which is equal to time taken for the first batch multiplied by the learning rate to the power number of cycles. And the third possibility is calculating variances due to an incorrect learning rate. Now, there had been a few past paper questions which have specifically mentioned that the management accountant has used the incorrect rate of learning. And we've been given a separate rate of learning and asked to recalculate the variances, which is likely to give rise to what we call a planning efficiency variance in terms of labor and operational variances. So these are calculations that you're likely to see. So a small suggestion would be for you to spend some time on revising your variances as well, okay? Specifically your labor-related variances, okay? Because as far as the examiner is concerned, this represents assumed knowledge. So it's knowledge brought forward just to make sure that you are well and truly aware of your variances so that you could answer your learning curve questions, right? So that's one particular topic. It's learning curves. Hopefully this has cleared out any issues you've had on learning curves. And let's quickly move on to a second one. It is a theoretical topic, really. It's something that the examiner has tested a few times, and a bit of a bonus if you really focus on what the examiner has been testing. It is product life cycles and product costing. So I'm going to be looking at both of these side by side, and let me also try to bring in a few other theories, okay, like kaizen and functional analysis, so that we recap those as we go along. Now, with product life cycle, you just look at the slide, you'll see you're looking at 4 basic stages, but let me talk about something that's not on this particular slide. Most companies, or in fact all companies, tend to go through what we call a development phase. And the development phase is not something that you will see on this particular slide, nor will you see it on any of the Cima material that you're required to run through. But it's useful to have this knowledge because a lot of companies spend millions, if not billions of dollars at the development stage, right, to get their product right, especially if they are launching innovative products which are not out there in the market. So you can make a bit of a difference in the market, capture the customer base. They spend a lot of money on this. And if we relate it to other theories that you would have gone through, in terms of quality related costs, you should be able to link this to a conformance cost. It is what we call a prevention cost. If you spend a significant amount of money on your development stage, get your product perfect, chances are you're not going to see very many defects. So companies do take a conscious effort to spend quite a bit of money getting their product perfect at the development stage. So really, before the introduction stage, companies do go through one more stage, before the introduction stage, they do go through one more stage, which is the development stage. And they do not earn revenues at that point. There's no production taking place. It's just a lot of costs that are spent in trying to get the product perfect. Okay? And you would see techniques like possibly reverse engineering being used by companies, not the ones that are putting out the innovative product, but companies that are in the development stage, copying other products, right, would use things like reverse engineering, where they'd take a competitor's product, rework it, and try to come up with their own product. So reverse engineering is one of those things that they do at their development stage. So we've discussed a couple of different types of companies. One that launches a very innovative, state-of-the-art type of a product, and another one which produces a product which is very similar to what a competitor has and what their development stage looks like. So after, of course, the development stage, we move into the 4 stages of your PLC, and what happens to the revenue, what happens to the production costs, and what other internal techniques these companies tend to use to ensure that the product lasts a longer period of time is what I hope to focus on. And we'll do that after a short break. Welcome back. And we were working on or discussing the product life cycle, and we've just run through the pre-introduction stage. Really, it's the development stage. So let's start looking at the other stages. Just looking at the slide, you'll notice that introduction, you'll see sales rising rapidly. You'll see the same thing happening with growth. Maturity, things start flattening out a little, and then decline. Things don't look so great for the organization. But let's look at these stages individually. So if we look at an introduction stage, what would the pricing for the product really look like? And that depends on the type of product that we talk about. Now, for example, if we do say that you've got an innovative, state-of-the-art type of a product, like what usually happens with the mobile phones, every time Apple comes out with a new phone, they do something very unique about it. So when they launch these new products, they tend to charge an extremely high price, something which we refer to as market skimming. So it's an extremely high price that gets charged. But some, on the other hand, tend to launch products which are very similar to what you find on the market. So being very, very simple, we might call it copying. There's copies of products that are already on the market. In that sense, the price that they charge cannot be an extremely high price, because there's nothing unique about their product. There's nothing to draw the particular customer to the product at the higher price. So effectively, what do these so-called producers or suppliers do? They tend to charge a price which is very low, right? Something we would call a market penetration strategy used by the company, right? So it's effectively a very low price used. So 2 different prices which you might see at the introduction stage. One is market skimming, which is a very high price, and the other is market penetration, which is a very low price. And this really depends on the type of product that we talk about. So focusing on the slide, you'll see product is launched at either pricing based on market penetration, which is a low price, or price skimming being adopted. And this is what you see at the introduction stage. And if we move on to looking at production costs, well, production costs at the introduction stage for a company are relatively high. Why? You aren't making a lot of sales. The product is still at its early stages. It's not as popular as it would be if it had been launched some time back. So sales are quite low. Your production is quite low. Your fixed costs are split over a smaller number of units. Employees are just getting used to the product, so there's still no real learning effect setting in, right? And you don't really have large enough scale to enjoy economies of scale. So effectively your production cost is quite high. And most companies at this particular stage tend to still make a loss because they're spending quite heavily promoting the product, right? Promotional costs are very high. You have production costs which are quite high. Maybe if you are using market skimming, your price is quite high, but you still need to recover all of those amounts of money that you spent on the development of the product. So you're still at a loss, right? So if the product then gets pushed on to the very next stage, the growth stage, right? They need to survive the introduction stage, move on to the growth stage, then we see a few changes again. If you look at price, right, prices tend to drop. If you've used market skimming, you've launched the product at a very high price, maybe there are a few customers who'd buy the product at that particular price because they want to be the first to get their hands on the product. But apart from that, your customer base is quite limited. So when you move into the growth stage of the PLC, companies tend to cut their price, reduce it slightly. Couple of reasons. One, so that they can appeal to a larger customer base. Now more people can afford it, so chances are that they'll be able to sell a larger number of units. Second, because competitors are likely to copy the product, use reverse engineering, get into the market, these companies will also reduce their price just to keep competitors out of the market or make the product less profitable, right, to actually get into. So the prices are cut for a couple of reasons. One, to appeal to the customers. The other is to distract or to an extent discourage competitors entering the market, right? So you'll see a marginal drop in prices. Production costs. Now production costs tend to drop quite significantly at this stage. Why? Well, you would see a large increase in your sales. With a large increase in sales, you will see quite a large increase in your output. So as output increases, your fixed cost gets split over a much larger number of units. You'll also see economies of scale setting in. Added to that, you will also see learning effect coming into the picture. Employees have produced this product repetitively and they've gotten better at it. So your production cost per unit tends to drop drastically at this stage. And this is where companies enjoy significant profits. And the company is still spending money promoting their product, but they are still able to earn a significant profit at this stage, right? So that's our second stage on the PLC. Moving on to the third stage. So if the company is able to successfully work with their product through the first two stages, you'll then see the product moving into the third stage, which is maturity. Now at the maturity stage, it's quite simple to look at the product because the prices do not change much. They are quite stable because you launched an innovative product, you cut prices because competitors were coming in. So competitors started coming in towards the latter part of your growth stage, and now you've got your product, you've got the competitor's product, and probably all of them at a similar price. You do not want to cut prices anymore to start a price war. So prices are relatively stable, right? And you look at production costs, they're quite stable as well. The learning effect has come and gone. Employees aren't learning anymore. The time taken to produce the unit isn't dropping anymore. So things are quite stable, right? Promotional costs, well, not that high. You just keep the customer informed about the product. But with selling prices being stable, production costs being stable, you are looking at stable profitability. In fact, towards the latter part of your maturity stage, well, profits might even start to decline. Okay, so that would effectively be your third stage of the PLC. But this brings us to a couple of very, very important points. Now, some companies do give special offers on their product. And they do play around with price a little, but they try to keep it to a minimum. They don't want to overdo it. Right? So you might see one-off drops in prices. But at this stage, it's very, very important that you take advantage, right, of principles such as kaizen, which is continuous improvement. Provided you can continuously improve, right, you should be able to ensure that there are at least marginal reductions in cost. Marginal reductions in cost, looking at things slightly differently, you might be able to drag this particular maturity stage slightly. Okay? You'll also see techniques like value analysis, functional analysis being carried out, just to ensure that you could tailor the product to the customer's requirements, remove any unwanted features of the product, and try to maintain your profitability, if not improve it. Right? So a couple of important other principles that could be used by companies at this stage, just to ensure that they have a bit of an advantage in terms of the cost. And the very last stage of the PLC would be your decline stage, where prices are probably at the lowest, and you'd see the marketing cost being kept to an absolute minimum. You don't really want to overspend in terms of the marketing costs, purely because demand for the product is dropping. Production costs probably have started to increase because demand for the product is now dropping. Fixed costs spread over a smaller number of units again. No further learning. Employees have switched to the next product that they're likely to produce, and effectively companies probably selling off products at a loss just to get rid of it, minimize their losses. Okay, that's the last stage of the PLC. A lot of companies at probably the end of the maturity stage do try to use strategies to extend the life of the product, right? But usually once they've gotten into the decline stage, they try to minimize the cost that they spend on the product, because it's likely to give them losses, right? So that is the PLC, and effectively what tends to happen over the PLC in terms of production cost, marketing cost, selling price, profits, losses, and a few concepts or principles that companies could use in terms of costs, right? We're going for a short break, and when we get back, we move on to the last bit of pricing. Welcome back. Right, so we've run through the PLC in detail, and just looking at the last bit of pricing. Now this is again a bit of a bonus in terms of what the examiner could test, and this is profit maximizing price. Okay, why I just want to focus on this rather than a couple of the other pricing methods, maybe cost plus and your things like a maximum price being charged, or controlled prices as we call it, is because this one is a particular topic which could even be tested as part and parcel of transfer pricing. So adds a little more value to be focusing on this particular topic, and we are talking about profit maximizing prices. Okay. Now just to give you a bit of background into this, well, the primary objective of most organizations is to maximize profits, and we are looking at exactly what price to charge to maximize this so-called profit, right? And this is something that you would have learned for economics probably at your certificate level, which is the profit maximizing point for an organization should be where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. MC equals MR. Okay, and you would have looked at a diagrammatic representation at your first level to try and do this, but then again, we can't be drawing diagrams here. So how is it that we actually go about this? And I'm just going to run you through a sequence of 5 simple steps, and this will help you come up with the profit maximizing price and the profit maximizing output. Once you know the profit maximizing price and output, you could calculate the total revenue at the profit maximizing point. You could even calculate the total profit, right? So it's 5 simple steps that we hope to run through. And why is it that companies would want to produce at this particular profit maximizing point? Well, you produce anything less, right? You produce anything less than this particular output, your marginal revenue will be more than your marginal cost. So you are able to earn extra profits. The revenue is greater than the cost. You're able to earn extra profits and you're losing out. If you produce anything more than the profit maximizing output, your marginal cost is more than the marginal revenue. And effectively, every extra unit you sell, you're making a loss, since costs are greater than the revenue. Okay, so this is the ideal point, or what we call the optimum production level. Right? So let's quickly focus on how we can actually go about solving this so-called profit maximization point. Based on an example, if we focus on the slide, you'll see variable cost of producing a unit is $20, which is also known as the marginal cost. Company currently sells 200,000 units at a price of $50. As price increases by $1, demand decreases by 4,000 units. And usually the examiner tends to give you information which says, as price increases by $1, demand decreases by 4,000 units, or as price decreases by $1, demand should increase by 4,000 units. So that's effectively the info that is given. And we need to come up with the profit maximizing quantity and price. So with this information, let's run through the sequence of steps. Step 1, calculate the marginal cost per unit, which was given to us in the scenario. It was basically $20 per unit, right? There are certain exam questions, the examiner just simply hands this out to you, which is given in the question. There are some exam questions where you will be required to use the high-low method to arrive at the variable cost per unit, which is effectively your marginal cost per unit, right? Second step, we need to derive the constants for your price formula. Now the price formula is y equals a minus bx, and this formula is given to you at the exam. So how do we calculate these constants? We start with b, which is the simpler thing to do. B is calculated as the change in price divided by the change in demand, right? Now remember that as price of a product, so it's always a negative relationship. The answer is always a minus. So you'll notice on the slide that I've, just for convenience, ignored the sign with the 1 and the 4,000. The answer has always got to be a negative. So price changes by 1, demand changes by 4,000, which gives me 0.00025. And I've put in the sign there, minus, because the answer has always got to be negative. Right? So this gives us the answer to B. And still, under step 2, we now need to calculate A. And to calculate A, we use the information given to us in the scenario. The information specifically mentioned, if I just quickly run through to that particular example, information tends to give us at a price of $50, we sell 200,000 units. So I use that particular price and quantity here. So price of 50, that's y is 50. A is unknown. B we just calculated, that's 0.00025, and X is effectively the output or sales or demand, which is 200,000. So once we solve this equation, we should end up with a value of 100 for A. So looking at the price equation, then y is equal to 100 minus 0.00025x. Right? And we now have an equation for price, which is our second step. Third step, we calculate a marginal revenue equation. Okay, where we come up with the marginal revenue equation, and this again is given to you at the exam. MR is equal to A minus 2BX. Right? Now we have the price function, which is A minus BX, and A, remember, is 100. B is minus 0.00025, and the only difference here is that you have a 2 there. So you multiply that by 2, and giving us the MR equation, which is 100 minus 0.0005x. So once you know the price equation, it's just a matter of making a slight adjustment there to arrive at your marginal revenue function. And Once we have that, that's 100 minus 0.0005x, we move on to our fourth step, which is equating marginal cost and marginal revenue. Marginal cost, which we arrived at from the very first step, was 20. Marginal revenue, 100 minus 0.0005x. Solve this and you've got 160,000 for x, which is our profit maximizing output. Right? This is our profit maximizing output. And the fifth and final step is calculating the price at the profit maximizing output. If we go back to that original equation, y equals a minus bx, which is y equals 100 minus 0.00025 multiplied by output, and we know the profit maximizing output is 160,000. We should be able to calculate the profit maximizing price, which is now 60. Right? Once you get the profit maximizing price and the profit maximizing output, if you want the total revenue at the profit maximizing point, multiply the two. If you want the profit, you've got total revenue, deduct your total cost, and you should have your profit. Okay? So this is another aspect that gets tested either as a 10-mark question under section A, or could even be part of your transfer pricing question in section B. So a very important aspect, but it's relatively simple, bonus marks, topic that you should not really ignore. But when you do look through this bit of pricing, be aware of the limitations as well. You know, charging a profit maximizing price is well and truly fine, but it really depends on what competitors are doing. Could we charge a profit maximizing price of 60 if competitors were charging $50? Which stage of the PLC are we at? Are we at the introduction stage? Should we really be charging a profit maximizing price, or maybe even use a market penetration approach if competitors are in the market? Right? Do we have the capacity to be operating this particular profit maximizing price? What if we have a capacity of 100,000 units and the profit maximizing price leads us to a profit maximizing output of 150,000 units? Right? So there are a lot of other factors that you have to consider before you actually decide on whether to charge this profit maximizing price or not. Right? So that brings us to the end of our first session on P2, and hope to see you again next time for a few more important concepts which should hopefully help you at your exam. Thank you.